"You don't have a family too?" Little girl asked the lonely CEO and invited him to her birthday. He came alone and left with a family. "Do you not have a family either?" The question broke the silence like a sharp crack in the cold air. Brian looked up, startled. In front of him stood a little girl, no more than 3 years old, with curly blonde hair, dirt-smudged cheeks, and a coat far too big for her small frame. She hugged a ragged teddy bear with one eye missing. The sky above Central Park was heavy and gray, winter biting through coats and gloves. Brian hadn't moved in over an hour. He sat slouched on a bench, dressed in a fine coat and scarf, looking every inch the successful man, but his eyes were hollow, lifeless. What did you say?" he asked. "I asked if you don't have a family too," she repeated softly. "You look sad. People who are sad are usually alone." Brian stared at her, stunned. No one had spoken to him like that in ages, so directly, so honestly. He hesitated, then replied, "No, not anymore." She nodded like it made perfect sense. "Me and Mommy don't have a family either, just us, and Teddy." She lifted the worn bear. "Today's my birthday. I'm 3. Brian opened his mouth, but the words stuck in his throat. She continued, "Mommy said we'll have pizza and cake tonight, just a little one. She saved for it. I get to blow out a candle. That's my favorite part." Brian swallowed hard. "But Mommy was sad this morning. She said the shelter was full, and we might have to sleep outside again. I told her it's okay. I said maybe if we invited someone to my birthday, it wouldn't feel so cold." She looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes. "You can come if you want. It's not fancy, just pizza. But I'll share." "You're inviting me?" he asked. She smiled. "Yes. It's behind the old pharmacy, near the wall that stays warm." Brian shook his head slightly, trying to process. "What's your name?" "Susan." "That's a beautiful name," he said gently. "Mommy says it was her grandma's. What's yours?" "Brian." "Well, Mr. Brian, would you like to come to my birthday party? You don't have to bring anything." He looked at her, really looked. Not a homeless child, not a stranger, just a little spark of light in the dark. He should have said no. He had meetings, calls, a schedule filled with things that once felt important. But none of them mattered. He stood, adjusted his coat, and nodded. "I'd be honored, Susan." She clapped her hands. "Yay! Mommy will be so happy." Brian followed her as she skipped ahead, her boots tapping against the sidewalk. The sun dipped lower behind the trees, casting long shadows across the park. For the first time in months, Brian felt a shift in his chest, small but real. He breathed easier, and he wondered how a child with so little could offer him something he hadn't known in years. Kindness that expected nothing in return. As Brian followed Susan through the dusky streets, something long buried stirred inside him. She skipped ahead, chatting to her teddy bear, unaware of how deeply she had already affected him. Her steps were light, full of trust, and she had chosen to trust him, a stranger in a suit with hollow eyes. His polished shoes clicked against cracked pavement, out of place in this part of the city. He didn't know why he had said yes. Maybe it was her voice, so innocent. Or maybe it was that question, "You don't have a family either," that struck deeper than he cared to admit. He hadn't always been alone. At 8, Brian lost his parents in a car accident. He remembered flashing lights, the soft voice of a social worker, and then the warmth of his grandmother's embrace. Margaret, a seamstress with arthritic hands and a kind soul, raised him on love and soup and bedtime stories. She became his whole world. When he found success in his 20s, she was his biggest supporter, and when she passed away last winter just before Christmas, something inside him went quiet. He didn't cry. He returned to work, buried himself in numbers and deadlines, and let the silence spread. His penthouse was sleek, modern, and cold. Birthdays passed unnoticed. Messages went unanswered. People called him a genius, a visionary, but no one called him home. More than once he had stood on his balcony, staring at the city lights, wondering how it would feel to vanish. The world would go on. His empire would continue. Until today, until a little girl in a torn coat looked at him, not through him, and saw what no one else had seen. "We're almost there, Mr. Bryan," Susan called over her shoulder, hopping over a frozen puddle. He nodded, swallowing a lump in his throat. This wasn't just a walk through the city anymore. It was a walk through memory, through loss. Susan reminded him of the boy he used to be, lost, afraid, until one person gave him a reason to believe again. Now here she was, a 3-year-old living on the edge of survival, inviting a stranger to her birthday simply because she sensed he was lonely. Bryan had poured fortunes into tech, automation, and progress. And yet, in this moment, he was being healed by something no machine could replicate, the compassion of a child. They turned a corner near an old pharmacy. Susan pointed to a narrow space between buildings. "That's where we're staying tonight. Mommy says the wall is warm from the heater." Bryan's heart tightened. A single blanket, a flattened cardboard box, and a crumpled paper bag made up their home. This was where she planned to celebrate. No table, no lights, no decorations. But she smiled anyway. In that moment, Bryan knew he would stay. Not out of pity, but because, for the first time in a long time, he felt a reason to. A quiet thread had been sewn through his chest, pulling him towards something real. He didn't know what this night would bring, but he would follow that thread. Because maybe, just maybe, it led back to life. Behind the old pharmacy, in a dim alley just past the subway tracks, a faint orange glow flickered from a makeshift lantern, a glass jar with a tea light inside. The air was bitterly cold, but the narrow space between buildings offered some shelter from the wind. There, kneeling on flattened boxes, was Ava. Her blonde hair, tied back in a messy ponytail, was damp from the mist. She wore a patched jacket and fingerless gloves, her movements careful as she arranged a tiny chocolate cupcake on an overturned crate. Beside it sat a small pizza box, still warm, emitting the smell of cheese and tomato. She had been saving for this for 3 weeks, collecting loose change, skipping meals, and doing odd cleaning jobs for passers-by, just to give Susan a birthday memory. Ava lit the single candle with a nearly empty matchbook, shielding the flame with her hand against the breeze. She was humming softly when she heard small footsteps approaching, familiar ones, and looked up with a tired but hopeful smile. "A birthday girl," she began, then froze as she saw the man walking behind her daughter. Bryan stopped a few steps away, unsure of what to say. Ava stood quickly, instinctively placing herself between Susan and the stranger. Her eyes were sharp, protective. Susan, unaware of the tension, grinned wide. "Mommy, this is Mr. Bryan. He's coming to my party." Ava looked him over. Tall, clean-cut, expensive coat, leather gloves. He did not belong here. Her guard went up even higher. Bryan removed his gloves and extended a hand gently. "Hi, I'm sorry if I startled you. Susan invited me, and I didn't want to disappoint her." Ava hesitated, then shook his hand briefly. "Ava," she said, "I'm her mother." Bryan nodded. "Thank you for letting me be here." There was a pause. Ava studied his face and saw no malice, no judgment, only a kind of quiet sadness that matched her own. She exhaled slowly and stepped aside. "Well, we don't have chairs, but you're welcome to sit." Bryan crouched down beside the little crate, lowering himself until he was eye level with Susan. "Is this the birthday feast you told me about?" he asked with a smile. Susan nodded proudly. "It's pizza, and Mommy got me a cupcake with a candle." Bryan looked at Ava, who gave a small shrug, as if to say, "It's all I could do." But he saw the effort, the love, in every detail. He pulled off his coat, folded it, and placed it on the cold concrete before sitting down on it. Ava blinked in surprise. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "I wanted to," Brian replied, looking at Susan. "This is her day." They all sat together, huddled in the cold, sharing the single pizza. Brian took only one slice, letting Susan enjoy as much as she wanted. She offered him the first bite of her cupcake, and he pretended to nibble before handing it back with exaggerated delight. "It's the best cupcake I've ever tasted," he said solemnly. Susan giggled. "You're silly, Mr. Brian." Then came the moment. Ava reached for the candle with her lighter. "Ready, sweetheart?" she asked. Susan nodded, eyes sparkling. Brian held up the cupcake carefully while Ava lit the candle. The tiny flame wavered in the cold air. "Make a wish," Ava said gently. Susan closed her eyes tight and whispered, I wish nobody ever has to be lonely." The candle flickered. She blew it out. Brian felt something crack open inside him. Not a wish for toys, not for a warm bed or even a home, but for no more loneliness. His throat tightened, and he turned slightly to hide his face, blinking back the wetness in his eyes. Ava noticed. She said nothing but looked at him differently now, less like a stranger, more like someone who understood. They sat in silence for a while after that, the pizza box empty, the cupcake half eaten in Susan's lap as she played with her bear. The quiet between them was not awkward, but peaceful. Brian looked around at the crumbling bricks, the echoing rattle of trains behind them, the cold seeping into his bones. Yet he felt warmer than he had in years. He turned to Ava and said softly, "She's extraordinary." Ava nodded. "She's all I have. And somehow, she's always the one who gives me hope." Brian looked at the candle wax hardening on the crate, then at Ava's hands, rough, red from cold, but gentle. He could see she was exhausted, fighting every day just to keep going. And yet, she had made this night special. Not grand, not glamorous, but real. Brian smiled, truly smiled, and Ava noticed. She tilted her head. "You okay?" He nodded. "I haven't smiled like that in a long time." Ava's expression softened. "Yeah, me neither." And there, in the cold and dark, surrounded by scraps and shadows, something warm flickered between them. Small, uncertain, but quietly beautiful. The next morning Brian returned to the alley behind the old pharmacy, his breath clouding in the cold air. The crate, the cardboard bedding, the little candle jar, everything was gone. The space was empty, lifeless. He stood there for a long time, hands deep in his coat pockets, heart sinking. He didn't even know why he expected they'd still be there. The streets were constantly shifting for people like Ava and Susan, shelter availability changing night by night. But something in him needed to see them again. Not out of guilt, not out of curiosity, out of something else, something quieter, deeper. Over the next 2 days, Brian searched. He visited soup kitchens, shelters, and food distribution spots, using his connections subtly. He did not ask his assistants. This was something he had to do himself. Finally, on the third evening, at a small downtown shelter that operated without city funding, he spotted them. Susan was coloring quietly at a folding table, her bear tucked under her arm. Ava was nearby, washing dishes with other volunteers in exchange for dinner and a sleeping spot. When she saw Brian, her eyes narrowed slightly. Cautious. "You found us," she said, drying her hands on a towel. He smiled gently. "Wasn't easy." Ava glanced around. "You didn't bring anyone else?" "No, just me." She relaxed only slightly. "Okay." Brian visited again the next day, and the next. He brought warm food in containers, claiming it was extra from his office events. Susan would squeal in delight at the smell of real chicken soup, while Ava stayed reserved, offering quiet thanks. He never asked questions, he never pried. Instead, he listened, he noticed. Susan's shoes were starting to fall apart. So he found a cobbler willing to repair them at no charge, and when that didn't work, he left a pair of high-quality children's boots at the shelter's donation box in Susan's size. When he saw Ava coughing and shivering one evening, he returned the next day with a soft wool scarf and a thick blanket. But she hesitated before accepting. "That's very kind," she said, "but I don't want to take too much from you." "It's nothing," he replied. "Really?" She looked at the scarf again, fingers brushing the edge. "It smells like something familiar." "It belonged to my grandmother," Brian admitted. "She used to say it could warm even the coldest heart." Ava held the scarf gently, her eyes distant. But when Brian offered money, discreetly, for a motel or a better shelter, Ava's expression hardened. "I appreciate it," she said calmly, "but no." Brian blinked, taken aback. "Why not?" "Because I don't want my daughter to grow up thinking that happiness comes from what someone gives you." She looked him in the eye. "I want her to see her mother fight for every bit of it." He was silent for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I understand." And he did, more than she realized. After that, he changed his approach. He began to help indirectly. He paid off a few shelter food bills without naming himself. He quietly arranged a doctor through a local clinic to check Susan's persistent cough, again using no name. He even contacted a nearby library to make sure Susan could have a children's card, so she and Ava could borrow books to read together. Ava noticed. Of course she did. She was no fool. But she also noticed something else. Brian never pushed. He never made her feel small. He never expected gratitude. Instead, he showed up. He brought fresh socks for Susan. He helped fix a broken zipper on Ava's old coat one night without saying a word. He laughed softly at Susan's stories, listened intently when Ava shared pieces of her day. Little by little, the walls Ava had built began to show tiny cracks. And though she would never admit it out loud, every time she saw him waiting quietly outside the shelter, holding a paper bag with dinner or a box of crayons for Susan, her heart beat just a little faster. Because kindness like that, it was rare and real. It was a quiet evening. The shelter was unusually calm, most of the residents already asleep, their soft murmurs fading into the cold night. Brian had brought over a thermos of hot cocoa and some leftover pastries from a cafe downtown. Fresh, sweet, still warm. Ava sat across from him at a metal picnic table outside the shelter, wrapped in the scarf he had given her weeks ago. Susan was curled up nearby on a blanket, her teddy bear tucked tightly in her arms. They sipped in silence for a while before Ava spoke. "Do you ever wonder how one moment can break your whole life apart?" she asked softly, not looking at him. Brian turned toward her, his expression open, inviting. "I used to be a nursing student," she said. "Top of my class. I had dreams of working in pediatric care. I was going to help kids like Susan." Her lips curled into a small, bitter smile. But that was before. Brian waited. She took a deep breath. "My guardian at the time. He was supposed to look out for me. My parents died when I was 17. He was their friend, took me in. I thought he was doing a good thing." Her hands tightened around the paper cup. But he didn't. He started crossing boundaries, first emotionally, then physically. I was too scared to tell anyone, too ashamed. And by the time I found the courage, I was pregnant. And alone. Brian's heart twisted. "I lost my scholarship, got kicked out of his house, and no one wanted to hire a 21-year-old pregnant girl with no address, no references, and no degree. I applied everywhere, cleaned motel bathrooms, waited tables until my feet bled. But the rent kept going up, and the jobs didn't last." She looked down, blinking hard. "Susan was born in a shelter. I remember holding her the first time and thinking, maybe now life would turn around." A long pause. It didn't. Brian's throat ached. He wanted to say something, to fix it, but she continued. I've been followed, harassed, offered deals by men who thought they were helping. She looked at him then, her eyes sharp. So, forgive me if I don't trust easily, if I don't melt just because a man brings soup and smiles. I'm not asking you to, Brian said quietly. I don't need to be saved, she added. I want someone who sees me, who understands. Brian set his cup down gently. I do see you, Ava. She looked away, her jaw tight. I used to think I was the most alone person in the world, he said after a moment. I lost my parents young. I was raised by my grandmother. She was the only person who ever truly cared about me. When she passed away last Christmas, something inside me shut down. I haven't felt whole since. He swallowed. Everyone thinks I have it all. Power, money, success. But none of that matters when there's no one waiting for you at home. Ava looked at him again, really looked this time. I sit in boardrooms, make million-dollar decisions, and then go home to silence, to nothing. There was something raw in his voice, unpolished. Real. I've never been as strong as you, Brian added, voice cracking slightly. What you've done, for Susan, for yourself, that's the kind of strength I've only read about. They sat there in stillness, two souls exposed under the dim shelter light, surrounded by the quiet hum of the city. Ava's shoulders eased just a little. Sometimes, she whispered, I'm so tired of being strong. I know, Brian said. But you don't have to carry everything alone. For a long moment they said nothing more. No declarations, no promises. Just a quiet, mutual understanding. Something had shifted between them. Not quite love, not yet, but something deeper than friendship. A connection forged not from charity or dependence, but from truth. And as Ava glanced down at her sleeping daughter, then back at Brian, she realized something she had not felt in years. She didn't feel alone. The knock on the shelter office door came just after lunch. Ava was folding donated clothes when the staff called her name. She turned, surprised to see a woman in a gray blazer, holding a clipboard, her expression professional but distant. Ms. Ava Moore? The woman asked. Yes, Ava replied cautiously. I'm with Child Protective Services. We received a report regarding your daughter, Susan. Ava froze. The woman continued. We have concerns about your living situation. Susan has been seen sleeping in unsanitary and unsafe conditions multiple times. We need to assess whether the current environment is appropriate for a child her age. No, please, Ava said, panic rising. She's fine. She's healthy. I take care of her. The woman's tone was measured. We understand you're doing your best, but safety is our top priority. Until a full evaluation is completed, we may need to place Susan in temporary foster care. Ava's knees buckled. No, please. She's all I have. You can't take her. I'm her mother. By the time Brian arrived at the shelter that evening, Ava was in tears, sitting outside with Susan clinging to her. A staff member quietly pulled him aside and explained what had happened. Without hesitation, Brian made several phone calls. The next morning he arrived at the CPS office with a neatly organized binder of documentation, photos of Susan healthy and smiling, lists of Ava's volunteer work, shelter staff testimonies, medical records showing Susan's recent checkup at the clinic he'd arranged, and records of the donations he had made anonymously to support their well-being. He also submitted a notarized letter offering to serve as a legal sponsor, willing to provide stable housing and ensure Susan's safety under Ava's custody. A week later, Ava and Brian sat side by side in a modest hearing room. Across the table sat two CPS representatives and a legal advisor. Susan waited outside with a volunteer. The lead agent spoke first. Ms. Moore, we have reviewed your case. There are serious concerns about your capacity to provide a secure home for your daughter. Ava's voice trembled. I've done everything I can. I don't have a lot, but she's loved. Every day, she's fed, she's clothed, she laughs, she's safe with me." One of the agents folded her arms. "But she sleeps on the street, no stable income, no permanent address." Brian stood. He reached into the binder and placed a photograph on the table, a picture of Susan and Ava from her birthday night, the cupcake candle glowing in the dark. Both mother and daughter were smiling. "I've been supporting them," Brian said firmly. "I can confirm that Ava has been taking every possible step to change their situation. I've watched her choose dignity over dependence, time and time again. She didn't ask me for help. I offered." The legal advisor raised an eyebrow. "And what's your relationship to the child?" Brian didn't hesitate. "I'm a friend, a witness, and if necessary, I'm prepared to take legal responsibility to ensure that Susan remains with her mother." There was a moment of silence. One of the agents looked at Ava. "Why didn't you disclose this earlier?" "Because I didn't want pity," Ava said softly. "I wanted to do it myself, for Susan. But I would rather accept help than lose her." The room was still. Then the lead agent looked at Brian. "You're willing to be listed as her sponsor, under legal scrutiny, until Ava can establish stable housing?" "Yes," Brian said simply. "And you're doing this without expecting anything in return?" Brian turned to Ava, then back to the agent. "I'm doing this because no one should have to lose their child just for being poor." There was something in his voice, steady, unwavering, that changed the energy in the room. Finally, the agent sighed. "Very well. We'll approve a 6-month protective plan. Ava retains custody under supervision, with Mr. Brian as sponsor." Ava covered her face and wept, this time in relief. Brian reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. She didn't move away. For the first time, she let him carry some of the weight. In the weeks following the CPS hearing, things began to shift, slowly but unmistakably. The sharpness in Ava's eyes softened. The way Susan giggled more freely. The way Brian lingered a little longer each evening, no longer just a visitor, but something closer to family. One chilly afternoon, as they shared hot chocolate in the shelter's community room, Brian cleared his throat. "I've been thinking," he said carefully. "There's more space than I need in my home, and I know it's a lot to ask, but if you'd consider it just until you get things fully settled, there's a room for both of you. You'd have privacy, safety, no obligations." Ava looked at him, hesitant. Before she could answer, Susan tugged gently at her sleeve and whispered, "Mommy, he was sad like us, but now he smiles." Ava's heart clenched. A few days later, she accepted. Moving in wasn't easy. The house was too clean, too quiet, too full of space that didn't quite feel like hers. But Brian gave her room, literal and emotional, to breathe. He made no demands. He simply offered comfort in small ways, a steaming cup of tea in the morning, a basket of fresh towels, a quiet knock before asking if she needed anything. Through a connection Brian discreetly arranged, Ava was offered a position as an assistant at a small, family-owned clinic. She nearly declined, afraid people would assume she got the job through pity. But instead of hiding behind Brian's name, she worked harder than anyone else. She arrived early, left late, and slowly won the trust of the doctors and nurses with her focus, her kindness, her quiet strength. She began to find herself again, not the girl who had once been broken, but the woman who had rebuilt from scratch. One evening, Ava returned home to find the lights dimmed, soft music playing. On the dining table was a home-cooked meal, not from a restaurant, but something Brian had actually made. It was a little burnt, and the salad was unevenly chopped, but her heart swelled. They laughed over dinner, trading stories of childhood, Brian recalling his grandmother's kitchen disasters, Ava describing Susan's love of putting ketchup on everything. After they tucked Susan into bed, Ava stood at the window, arms folded, watching the snow fall. Brian joined her silently. "He's happy here," Ava said softly. "So am I," he replied. There was a pause, the air heavy with something unspoken. "I used to think love was something I didn't deserve," Ava whispered. "After everything. I didn't think anyone would want me. Not really." Brian turned to her. "You've never been unwanted. Not for a second." She met his gaze, and in it she saw the truth. Not charity, not obligation, but love. Steady, patient, real. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Ava's breath caught. "This belonged to my grandmother," he said, opening it to reveal a delicate vintage ring. "She used to say it held all the love in the world." He knelt, not grandly, not with a speech rehearsed by heart, but with quiet, trembling sincerity. "I lost my family a long time ago, Ava. But that day in the park, when your daughter looked at me like I mattered, when you let me sit with you in the cold, I found something again. I found home." He looked up, eyes glassy. "I love you. I love Susan. Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Ava's cheeks as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and for the first time in years, both of them felt whole. Not because they'd been rescued, but because they had chosen, together, to stay. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and warm vanilla, wrapping the room in a comforting warmth that felt more like love than air. Balloons in pastel colors floated lazily near the ceiling, tied to the backs of chairs and kitchen cabinet handles. Laughter spilled out from every corner, bouncing off the walls like music. In the middle of it all hung a handmade banner. "Happy 4th birthday, Susan." The letters were uneven, drawn in crayon, surrounded by hearts and stars and one misshapen teddy bear that was unmistakably modeled after hers. On the table stood a 3-tier cake, carefully decorated with pink frosting, edible glitter, and tiny sugar stars. Susan, standing proudly on a chair, wore a paper crown with her name written in sparkly purple marker and a frilly white dress that poofed out like a cloud around her knees. Her cheeks were flushed with joy, her eyes wide with wonder. Around her gathered 10 children, clapping and cheering. They were boys and girls, all under 10, all once without homes, families, or birthday candles of their own. But tonight, they weren't forgotten. They were guests, honored and cherished, in a house built on second chances. Brian leaned against the doorway, his hands tucked into his pockets, watching with quiet awe. Ava stood beside him in pale blue scrubs, her blonde hair pulled into a neat ponytail after her shift at the clinic. She nudged his arm gently, and he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "She made that wish last year," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "And somehow it all came true." Ava smiled, eyes glistening. "She's always known what matters most." "Okay, Susan," Ava called, walking over to the table. "Make your wish." Susan scrunched her eyes shut, hands clasped tightly in front of her chest. Everyone fell silent. Then, with one big breath, she blew out all 4 candles at once. The room erupted in cheers. "Frosting on your nose," one little boy shouted, giggling as Ava gently dabbed Susan's face with a napkin. After the cake, Ava gathered the kids into a circle on the living room rug for games and songs, their giggles filling the house. Brian stepped back to take it all in. The fireplace glowed softly in the background. Toys were scattered across the floor. A coloring book lay open on the coffee table, a crayon still mid-page. The house, once a cold museum of polished silence, now echoed with life. Since their wedding 6 months ago, he and Ava had co-funded the Haven Light Foundation, an organization aimed at helping single mothers and homeless children find not just shelter, but dignity, purpose, and belonging. Ava had returned to nursing school part-time and now oversaw outreach clinics through the foundation. Brian handled the finances, logistics, and board meetings, but it was Ava's empathy and Susan's hope that gave the mission its heartbeat. As the evening wound down, children played with new toys while Ava helped clean up the last of the cake crumbs. Susan, now in fuzzy pajamas, climbed into Brian's lap with a yawn. She leaned against his chest, small fingers gripping his shirt. "Mr. Brian," she mumbled sleepily, still clinging to the name she'd given him so long ago. "Yes, sweetheart?" She looked up at him with heavy eyes. "You have a family now, right?" His throat tightened. He looked across the room at Ava, who was folding a blanket, and then down at the child, who had unknowingly saved him. He pulled her close, kissed the top of her head, and whispered, "And it's the most wonderful family in the world." If this story touched your heart, reminded you of the power of kindness, or made you believe in second chances, then you are already part of something beautiful. Because here at Soul Stirring Stories, we believe in the healing strength of love, resilience, and human connection. Every week we share true-to-life, heartwarming stories just like Brian, Ava, and little Susan's. Stories that remind us that even in the coldest moments, hope can still find its way in. If you'd like to hear more stories that stir the soul and warm the heart, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and most importantly, subscribe to the Soul Stirring Stories channel. Your support helps us keep sharing these powerful moments with the world. Until next time, keep believing in love, in miracles, and in the strength of the human spirit.